Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We are going a little bit early today because the embargo for Wicked drops later on this afternoon, and I wanted to give the little YouTube gremlins a little bit more time to get the video out. And also, I'm in a little temporary home today because I'm out of town catching a few screenings. So this is a home base you'll see for the next couple of videos. But let's look at the box office for this past weekend. And the number one movie was Red One, which opened to a final total of $32.1 million. It was about $2 million below the estimates. And we're going to have a lot to say about that opening versus the film's budget and what The Rock is really commanding as far as box office openings lately. In second place was Venom: The Last Dance, which dropped 53.9% and brought in another $7.3 million. Its domestic total is now over $125 million. The Best Christmas Pageant Ever dropped 51.3% to bring in another $5.2 million. That's a little bit steeper than I would have thought, but it's also going to play out over the holiday season. Its domestic total is now just under $20 million. Heretic drops 52.3%. That's pretty good for a horror film. It brought in $5.1 million. It swapped with the Best Christmas Pageant Ever, coming in below it, whereas it opened higher than that film last week. Its domestic total now over $20 million. The Wild Robot hanging around the top 5. Another great hold. It drops 36.2%, brings in another $4.2 million. Its domestic total now just south of $140 million, and I'm interested to see what it does over the Thanksgiving week if they keep it in theaters that long. There's a lot of big movies that are coming in that may cost the Wild Robot some theaters, but it's also holding really well. In sixth place was Smile 2, which brought in another $2.9 million. Its domestic total is now at $65.6 million. Conclave drops just 31.7% in week number 4 and brings in $2.8 million. In eighth place is a film called Hello, Love Again, which is a romance from the Philippines. It brought in $2.3 million, and it actually set a record for the widest release ever here domestically for a Filipino film, as well as the highest weekend gross ever for a Filipino film. It wasn't even really on my radar coming into the weekend, so great news for Hello, Love Again. In ninth place was A Real Pain, which expanded into wide release, a 656% jump in business because it was in just a handful of theaters last weekend. It brought in $2.2 million. And in 10th place was Anora, which dropped 30.2% in its second weekend in wide release and brought in $1.7 million. Its domestic total is now over $10 million. So let's talk about Red One from a couple of different angles. First of all, I guess this would be counted as the good news for an original concept. And when I say original concept, I know we've debated this on the show before. I'm talking about a movie that's not based on anything pre-existing, a real story, a book, a movie, nothing. It's a completely original concept. Red One actually had the fourth best opening of the decade for a movie with a completely original concept. At number 1 was Nope, which opened to $44.3 million. Then we had Onward back in 2020. That opening would likely have been much higher, but that was just as theaters were starting to close and people were getting skittish about COVID-19. So $39.1 million in second place. Then we had If from this summer at $33.7 million. The estimated total for Red One would have put it above If, but it actually comes in below at $32.1 million in fourth place. And then we have The Lost City at $30.4 million in fifth place. So yes, Red one of the best opening original concepts of the decade. But I think this list just underscores how few movies there are, or perhaps more accurately, how big openings there are for movies that are based on absolutely nothing that was pre-existing. It falls just short of the year so far as non-franchise films. We're going to update that list next week, but let's talk a little bit about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and the budgets on his films. Red One had a reported budget of around $250 million. It is an Amazon movie, and we'll talk about the whole streaming economy when it comes to theatrical releases in just a couple minutes. But The Rock, especially lately, has had movies with very high budgets that aren't exactly commanding the blockbuster type of opening that you would expect. These are the 10 biggest domestic openings for Dwayne "The Rock Johnson when he is the top billed actor, meaning he is the first name that you see in the credits. And you can see that his highest opening film domestically, again, when he is the top billed actor, not part of an ensemble, and also not Moana, because he actually didn't have top billing in that film, was Black Adam, which opened to $67 million, but it had a budget of $200 million. That movie was not, despite what he says, a financial success in the theatrical window. Then we had Hobbs and Shaw, which opened to $60 million, also against a $200 million budget. However, its worldwide gross was able to bail it out just a little bit. Then we have some of the more reasonable openings. Jumanji: The Next Level opened to $59.2 million, had a $125 million budget, and did great both domestically and internationally. San Andreas had a $110 million budget, opened to $54.5 million, and again, based off of that budget point, was a financial success. Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, the first Jumanji film that The Rock did, a $90 million budget, opened to $36.1, but it was a runaway success. That was a smash hit domestically and internationally, but still, that's a great budget point. Then we have The Scorpion King, which is actually The Rock's sixth best opening ever. It opened to $36 million, only had a budget of $60. It wasn't a huge blockbuster hit, but again, and remember, these are not adjusted for inflation, based on how much was spent, that's not a terrible number. Rampage had a budget of $120 million. It opened at $35.7 million domestically. And again, any financial upside to that movie is because the budget was at $120 million. Central Intelligence opened at $35.5 million. It had a budget of $50 million. And then we have two of the latest ones for Dwayne Johnson. Jungle Cruise, which opened at $35 million, had a budget of $200 million. Now, you do have to take into account this was during the early recovery from the pandemic. It was available to rent day and date on Disney Plus, so some people might put an asterisk there, and that wouldn't be unfair. And then we have Red One. I have it listed here at $225 million. I'm splitting the difference between the reported budgets of $200 and $250, but it opens to $32.1 million. And when you look at these breakdowns and how The Rock is actually opening movies when he is a top billed actor, it seems pretty obvious to me that if we're going by supply and demand, then Dwayne Johnson, if you want to sustainably make money on these releases, should be headlining movies that cost about $100 to $125 million on the high end, again, based on the domestic performance. And yet he keeps doing movies that are at $175, $200, $225, $250 million. The free market hasn't really said that a Dwayne Johnson movie should cost that much if you want to make that back in the theatrical window or come close to making that investment back in the theatrical window. So this is something I think he's going to have to address. If he wants to keep making these big movies, the people are saying, okay, but they really shouldn't cost that much if you want this to be a reliable financial success. So if I was going to give The Rock advice, I would say, hey man, you can keep making movies, but you got to get the cost down. Now, Red One, with a budget of between $200 and $250 million, opening at $32 million domestically, if this were a standard studio film, we would be talking about how much of a disaster that is. I mean, that is on the level of The Marvels and Joker Folie à Deux. We would absolutely be screaming about what a terrible opening it is, and yet that talk has been muted because this is a streaming release. Amazon wanted the movie originally to be a streaming film, decided to go theatrical, and even given this low opening, I'm hearing the same arguments for this movie that I heard about Apple movies, which is, okay, well, yeah, it opened way low compared to the budget, but it's a completely different financial model. Some people saying, well, you know, Amazon really just wanted to make the investment back in marketing, and they've got another revenue plan for the movie down the line, and yet nobody's ever really been able to elucidate what that revenue plan is. Is it selling advertising against the movie when it hits streaming? Okay, but that is kind of with the assumption that Red One is going to do well on streaming, and that's not necessarily the case with these streaming films. Everyone says, well, it's a huge company. Amazon, it's so massive, it doesn't really matter because they've got so much money, and yet that's the same thing that was said about Apple, and Apple announced plans to scale back their big budget film releases because they were losing so much money, not only in the theatrical window, but also, it would seem, because they're not performing as Apple thought that they would do on streaming. This has been a consistent thing with streaming. Whenever anybody brings up how they're going to make money, the argument is always, well, they've got a business plan that we just don't understand. And I would argue that even if Amazon has other plans for Red One, and I will grant that it is not a traditional release or rollout because you do have Amazon Prime Video, etc. Even given that, this is a disappointing opening for the film, no matter what the plans are down the line. I can't imagine that if you were going to call somebody over at Amazon headquarters and ask, hey, are you satisfied with the opening of Red 1? I don't really think that anybody would say that they are. Now, this is a show about theatrical box office revenue. That's why when I do those profit breakdowns, I make sure to specify this is theatrical revenue only. And it appears with the low opening domestically, as well as the underwhelming results overseas, that Red 1 is not going to be a money maker in the theatrical window. I think it's actually going to lose a healthy amount of money unless it happens to play really well across the holiday season. That's happened before. We'll see if that happens this time with Red 1. There is a lot of competition, including from Dwayne Johnson himself with Moana 2 coming up. So we'll see what the final word is on Red 1. But for people that are saying, well, it doesn't really matter that the movie opened this low, because I don't buy into that. I think it still does matter because Amazon did decide to go theatrical with it. And I think on the bigger picture, I think it should matter to The Rock and to his team, because this is yet another example that he is not a huge box office draw on his own. Even with Chris Evans, he wasn't a huge box office draw. And okay, if you want to give him a pass for this movie, that's fine, but that doesn't mean he gets a pass for every movie. And I think this is going to make it a little bit more difficult for studios to keep greenlighting films at this huge budget point. The Rock has had, I think, a much longer leash at the box office as far as underwhelming box office results than most people. And I think it's because he's got a huge personality. He goes out there, he does promotion, people like him, but that seems to be running out just a little bit. The goodwill, the good PR, when you read some of the stories about the production of this film. And I think that we really are at an inflection point as far as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and his career, because it's becoming very obvious that there's a somewhat limited appeal for what he is currently doing. So we either have to look at a reinvention or a way to reinvest that money, because something here isn't quite working. There were 3 movies that dropped out of the top 10 this past weekend. Terrifier 3 is out after 5 weeks. We Live in Time is out of the top 10 after 4 weeks. And Here exits the top 10 after just 2 weeks. So another chapter in the disappointing story of Here for Robert Zemeckis, Tom Hanks, Robin Wright, etc. Looking at the biggest theater count changes for the past weekend, A Real Pain is at number 1. It added 1,173 theaters. It's now in a total of 1,185. Here lost 959 theaters after that 2-weekend guarantee that most major studio releases get. It's still in 1,774. Look for it to lose a lot more as theaters make way for Gladiator II and Wicked this upcoming weekend. Weekend in Taipei lost 826 theaters. This is a movie that opened outside of the top 10. It's now in only 195, not a big leash for that film. Absolution, the latest Liam Neeson, lost 800 theaters. It's now in 150, and We Live in Time lost 705 theaters, although it is still in wide release at 1,160. Looking at what I like to call our box office road to recovery, the blue line is the 2015 to 2019 weekend average. The red line is for the years 2021 to 2023, and the dotted black line is every weekend this year. And the trend continues, as we saw in October, continuing on into this month, of being well below both where we were and where we have been for the last few years. The top performing film for the 2021 to 2023 window was the second weekend of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. The top performing film of the 2015 to 2019 window was actually the debut of Justice League, which opened to around $93 million, but was a financial disappointment because it didn't have longevity and because it cost so much. Of course, we're looking for a big spike this upcoming weekend with not one, but 2 major releases hitting theaters, as well as the movies that are being carried over. So we'll see what Wicked and Gladiator II can do to this graph. And the domestic box office is something we talked about at length last week, and I think maybe I should have been more clear when I asked the fan question last week. whether the remainder of 2024's releases could take the box office to $8 billion. That was the domestic box office, not the worldwide box office. But still, we have a ways to go. Red One didn't really do anything for that. We looked at the numbers last week. It was basically the major releases that are still coming out this year would have to average $146 million. And I asked you, the members here on the channel, whether the remaining releases could take us to that $8 billion mark or not. And it was a very close poll, but it seems that many of you are very optimistic about the box office for the rest of the year. 53% said that yes, the rest of 2024's releases will get the domestic box office to $8 billion. 47% of you said no, it will not. And one of the major players, if we're going to hit that $8 billion, is Wicked, which is opening this weekend alongside Gladiator II. It has seen a massive marketing push. The review embargo drops later today. Social media buzz has been very positive, but it usually is. And you can see what I say about the film later on today. But there does seem to be a buzz in the air about Wicked. And full disclosure here, when I asked this question, I looked to see if this was even a realistic question to ask at the showings in my local market, and I saw sellouts not just on Thursday night and Friday night, but going into Saturday night and Sunday as well. And it seems like it could be a possibility that Wicked is one of those movies that people knew would be popular, get it, but maybe are underestimating or that the analysts can't really track. So I'm asking again to see if that optimism carries over in this week's member question, because my question this week is, will Wicked break Beauty and the Beast's domestic opening weekend record for a musical, which currently sits at $174.7 million. Now, that is way outside of where many people are tracking the film, but I've seen those tracking estimates move up to around, in some cases, $150 million. So really, the question is, how high are you on Wicked? Are you going to go out on a limb and make this prediction? I will say that I'll be watching the poll, and I will likely cut off the responses starting on Friday, because I don't want people to basically hedge their bets and see what the movie's going to do and then vote. So if you want to vote in this poll, you should vote early. And to vote in the poll, you need to be a member here on the channel. Depending on where you're watching, there should be a button to allow you to become a member, or there's a link down in the description below. It's a very low monthly fee. You get to vote in the polls. You also get to have custom badges, custom emoji, early access to select videos. And I'd love to have you here because I love including the member voices here on the show. And that's what the members are going to weigh in on this week. Are you going to go out on a limb and say that Wicked could be a record breaker, or do you think that it'll fall short, which, by the way, falling short of $174.7 million isn't too shabby either. All right, let's take a look outside of the domestic marketplace to the top 5 films internationally. And at number 1 is Gladiator II, which got a head start on its domestic release by opening in many territories internationally and is the number 1 movie at $87 million. That is the highest international opening ever for a Ridley Scott movie, so a great start there for Gladiator II. Venom: The Last Dance is in second place at $17.3 million. Then we have Red One at $14.7 million. Paddington in Peru continues its run in the UK and elsewhere at $8.6 million. And then in 5th place is a film called To Gather Around, which made $8.5 million. To Gather Around was the top film in China over the weekend, about an employee at a tech company who finds himself in an escalating series of troubles. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our domestic numbers, we get the top 5 films worldwide. Gladiator II, based just off of its international total, is still the number 1 movie in the world at $87 million. Red One saw an 83% increase in business because it did have that domestic opening. It brought in $48.7 million, but its worldwide total sits at $84 million, which is less than Gladiator II made in just one weekend, just internationally. So that is a kind of a look at how the things are shaping up between those two movies. Venom: The Last Dance lost about 50% over the past weekend. It brought in $24.6 million. Its global total is now at $436.1 million. It's flirting with being one of the top 10 worldwide films of the year. The Wild Robot had another great hold everywhere in the world. It dropped just 34.2% and brought in another $10.2 million. Its worldwide total is now over $300 million. And Paddington in Peru dropped 29.9%. That's a good hold. And remember, these are international markets only. It brought in $8.6 million for a global total of $23.7 million. We've got a lot more to break down about the box office this week, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this show. This video is brought to you by The Perfect Gene. I love talking numbers here on the channel, so here's a number for you. 400,000. That's how many guys have been living comfortably by trying out The Perfect Gene. We're coming up on Thanksgiving, and anyone who's had too much turkey knows that the MVP of that holiday isn't the best quarterback on TV. It's a comfortable pair of pants, the kind that make you look respectable for a turkey dinner, but are also stretchy enough to accommodate that post-feast bulk. No matter how big you are or plan on getting, The Perfect Gene is the choice for you. They come in waist sizes from 26 to 50 and lengths from 26 to 38, which means there are 5,000 possible combinations of pants for you to shop for. And I can promise you, you will find those perfect pants because my pair of Perfect Jeans are by far the most comfortable ones that I own and the ones that I'll choose to wear so I can have those extra sweet potatoes without feeling like I'm going to pop a button. Not only does the Perfect Jeans say you'll love their pants, they back it up as well, offering free shipping, exchanges, and returns, making your order risk-free and way less hazardous than navigating conversation with some of your families on Turkey Day. It's finally time to stop putting up with uncomfortable jeans by going to theperfectgene.nyc. Listeners and viewers of the show get 15% off your first order, plus free shipping, free returns, and free exchanges when you use the code DAN15 at checkout. That's 15% off for new customers at theperfectgene.nyc with promo code DAN15. After you purchase, they're going to ask where you heard about them, so please support the show and tell them that I sent you. F your khakis and get the Perfect Gene. Let's take a look at some of these specialty charts, and we'll start with the per theater averages for this past weekend. At number 1 was All We Imagine as Light, which was a big hit at Sundance and is making an awards season push. It made $15,625 per theater in 3 theaters. Then we had Hello, Love Again. It only played in 248 theaters and brought in $9,379 per theater, so very smart marketing and programming and knowing where to play that movie. And I read that it is actually going to now get a wide release based on the success of its opening weekend. So I like that release strategy. Red One comes in third. It brought in $7,963 per theater in over 4,000 theaters. Then we had Cat Video Fest 2024, which was brought back to 4 theaters and brought in nearly $3,400 per theater, followed by Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which played in 5 theaters and brought in just over $2,500 per theater. Looking at the top films in limited release, this is 1,000 theaters or fewer. Hello, Love Again was number 1 at $2.3 million. Then we had UFC 309, which played in an unknown number of theaters and brought in around $347,000, I guess, for people that couldn't watch the Logan Paul-Mike Tyson fight, which would be almost everyone. It was literally impossible to watch, and even when you could watch it, it was still hard to watch. So I guess many people were also watching UFC 309. Small Things Like These comes in third place at just under $250,000 in 413 theaters. Then we have 2 films from India, Kanguva, which brought in $219,000, just a few $100 actually ahead of Bulaya 3, which brought in, like I said, about $400 less than Kanguva. These 2 films have been going back and forth. They've made almost identical totals over the last few weekends. Looking at the 2024 fall holiday box office, so this is everything post-Labor Day to the end of the year. Beetlejuice sits on top right now. Will it be dethroned by Wicked, Gladiator II, or both? We'll find out very soon. The Wild Robot's in second place at $137.6 million, followed by Venom: The Last Dance, which is moving up quickly at $127.5 million. Smile 2 remains in fourth, followed by Transformers 1, Joker: Folie à Deux, Terrifier 3, and Speak No Evil. Red 1 enters the chart at number 9 with $32.1 million. That puts it ahead of Conclave at number 10, and We Live in Time is now out of the top 10 for this seasonal box office. Before we take a look at the streaming charts, I wanted to take a look back at a weekend in box office history, as we often do here on the show, and we're going to go back 30 years to the premiere of a film in one of my favorite franchises of all time, Star Trek. Star Trek Generations, God, this makes me feel so old, opened 30 years ago on the weekend of November 18th through the 20th to $23.1 million. It would eventually make $75.6 million. In second place was Interview with the Vampire, which dropped 52.1% in its second weekend and brought in $17.4 million. However, it legged out very well and made $105 million. The Santa Claus was in its second weekend. It dropped just 11.3% at $17.1 million. Its total to that point was $40.5 million, but of course it played extremely well over the holiday season. It ended up at $144.8 million. In fourth place was The Lion King, which was a summer hit for Disney. They put it back into theaters for the holiday season. It brought in $5.5 million. That took its domestic total up to $272.9 million, and the final domestic gross for its original release was $312.8 million. So it was able to accumulate about $40 million more over the holiday season. And then in fifth place is a movie that in many circles is called Leon, or is called Leon the Professional, but I can attest it was known here in the US solely as The Professional when it was released and for many years after. It opened in fifth place to $5.3 million. It would eventually gross $19.5 million. And instead of adjusting for inflation every week, we'll do that a lot of weeks with the Box Office Flashback. I want to do what I did last week, which is to ask a little bit of a trivia question. And this is about Star Trek. I mentioned it was one of my favorite franchises. Star Trek Generations opened at number 1. And in fact, since 1979, only one Star Trek movie has not opened number 1 at the domestic box office. Can you name which one it is? I'll give you a moment to think. If you want to pause the video, you can pause and give it a ponder. But if you're done thinking, I'm going to give you the answer right now. The answer is Star Trek Nemesis, which opened on December 13th, 2002. It was the last movie featuring the Next Generation crew, and it opened at number 2 behind Made in Manhattan by less than $200,000. Made in Manhattan made $18.7 million, and Star Trek Nemesis made $18.5 million. So Jennifer Lopez, or if you're more inclined, Ralph Fiennes, is the only thing that stood in the way behind an unblemished record for the Star Trek franchise as far as opening at number 1. So that's what's going on at the box office. Let's take a look at the world of streaming, and we'll start with the latest numbers that we have from Netflix. New numbers are coming out later today, but this covers the week of November 4th through the 10th. At number 1 was the Netflix original movie Meet Me Next Christmas, which brought in 18.1 million views, followed by another Netflix film, Let Go, which is a Swedish film about a troubled family. It brought in 15.88 million views. Time Cut stays in the top 5. It brought in another 14.87 million views, followed by Don't Move, also staying in the top 5 at 9.13 million views. Outer Banks Season 4 debuted the second part of its season, which boosts it back into the top 5 with 8.6 million total views over the entire season, not just that second drop of episodes. Arcane Season 2 debuts in 6th place, although keep in mind this was a Saturday drop, which comes at the very end of this cycle, so we'll see with this next set of numbers how it did in the days after that. However, for the couple days of numbers that we have, it brought in 6.3 million views, and of course it continues to debut new episodes, including the final ones this Saturday. The Netflix original documentary Martha comes in 7th place with 6.21 million views, followed by Season 2 of The Diplomat with 5.86 million views. Murder Mindfully Season 1, a Netflix original series, debuts in 9th place at 4.67 million views. And then Countdown, Paul vs. Tyson, the series leading up to the supremely disappointing fight that they aired, comes in 10th place at 4.44 million views. That is going to be the blockbuster number, is what kind of viewership that fight had. There have been reports that 60 million people were watching that fight at its peak. We will see what Netflix brings in, because we'll see not only the people that were watching it that night, but the people that watched it later on. We could be looking at a very big number for that fight. The only thing that might hold it back is that it is a very long program, over 4 hours long when you include all of the undercards, etc. And the way that Netflix calculates its views is watch time divided by run time. So will that hold back the big fight? We will see on next week's show. Let's take a look now at the Nielsen streaming numbers. Now, these are delayed by about a month because that's how long it takes Nielsen to calculate the data, and it covers domestic streaming viewership only. And looking first at the most watched streaming movies, this is for the week of October 14th through the 20th. At number 1 was Anna Kendrick's film Woman of the Hour on Netflix, which brought in 9.2 million hours watched, followed by Bad Boys Ride or Die, Sing, and Inside Out 2. Unhinged, which was one of the first movies back in theaters. I think it was the first major movie back in theaters as they reopened back in 2020, comes in 5th place at 5.4 million hours watched, followed by Pixels. Then we have The Nightmare Before Christmas. This was during spooky season, so it's no surprise this returns to the chart, over 4 million hours watched. Then we have the Netflix original film Lonely Planet, followed by the Netflix original documentary The Menendez Brothers, and rounding out the top 10 is Snake Eyes, G.I. Joe Origins, which is literally the first time I've thought about that movie since it came out. It brought in 3.7 million hours watched. We have a little bit of change as far as the most watched streaming movies of the year through October 20th. Inside Out 2 is now the 3rd most watched streaming movie of the year, if you're calculating by hours watched, at 60.4 million hours watched, although it is well behind the Super Mario Brothers movie and Moana, which easily hold the numbers 1 and 2 spot. Damsel moves down to 4th place, Trolls Band Together moves down to 5th, Rebel Ridge moves down to 6th, Beverly Hills Cop Axel F moves down to 7th, The Union moves down to 8th, and then rounding out the top 10 are Inside Out and Amazon's 2024 remake of Roadhouse. Looking at the most watched streaming shows for October 14th through the 20th, at number 1 was the debut of the new season of The Lincoln Lawyer, bringing in 27.3 million hours watched, followed by Love is Blind, Outer Banks, Bob's Burgers, and Bluey. Lost hits the charts once again. It's been popping up on Netflix and brings in some pretty good viewership numbers, 13.7 million hours watched, followed by Family Guy, Grey's Anatomy, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, which is wrapping up a pretty impressive run in the top 10. When we look at the 10 most watched shows as far as watch time per available episode, this covers the top 10 streaming shows broken down by how many hours were watched per available episode. At number 1 was Agatha All Along. This was in the middle of its run through 6 episodes, so next week's numbers will cover the finale of the show. It ended its season with 2 episodes premiering at once, but it brought in 1.14 million hours watched per episode, which means that the numbers aren't big enough because it's competing against a bunch of other shows to get into the top 10, but on a per episode basis, it's consistently bringing in over 1 million hours watched per episode, which to me says that it drew pretty consistent viewership. Monsters, Lyle and Eric Menendez comes in 2nd place at just over 1 million hours watched per episode, followed by The Lincoln Lawyer at 900,000 hours watched per episode. This is for all of its seasons, which would be 3 full seasons available. Nobody Wants This comes in 4th place, followed by Secret of the River. Tulsa King remains in the top 10 on the watch time per available episode chart. It's a very popular show, more so than it has been in past seasons, 625,000 hours watched per episode. Then we have Outer Banks in 7th place, followed by Love is Blind, Only Murders in the Building, and Lost, rounding out the top 10. And then a couple of revisions here for some of our Nielsen streaming charts. First of all, as far as the most watched original streaming series of the year, 2024, Monsters, Lyle and Eric Menendez moves up to number 7, bumping Love Island down to number 8. The rest of the top 10 remains the same, including Bridgerton, which is at number 1 with 281 million hours watched, although Love is Blind is starting to creep up a little bit at 213.7 million hours watched. And speaking of Love is Blind, the success of the latest batch of episodes has actually moved it up the list as far as the most watched original streaming series since Nielsen started reporting data back in 2020. Love is Blind has now bypassed The Crown to be the 4th most watched original streaming series over that span at a little under 600 million hours watched. The Crown moves down to number 5. The top 3 remain the same, with Stranger Things, Ozark, and Bridgerton. And that's a look at the charts for this week. Let's take a look at some of the things that you can watch in theaters and on streaming in this upcoming week. Of course, we have 2 big movies hitting theaters on Friday. One of them is Wicked. You will see my review of that movie right here later today. The other is Gladiator II. I'll have my review of Gladiator II up tomorrow morning because I get to see it tonight. I'm super excited about that. Also opening in theaters around the country is Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Spy, Assassin, which is the latest film from Angel Studios. It's about a pastor who is caught up in a plot to kill Hitler. And I mean, I guess this goes without saying, but this is a World War II era movie. There's not some sort of weird time travel happening. Opening in limited release is the documentary Porcelain War, about 2 artists who are in Ukraine during the onset of the war with Russia. This won the Grand Jury Prize for Documentary Filmmaking at Sundance and is likely being pushed for an Academy Award nomination. Hitting Netflix on Friday is Spellbound, an original animated film using a lot of the talent in past movies like Shrek and some of the movies that have come from Disney. We'll see if that stacks stacks up against the very healthy competition that we're seeing theatrically. Also hitting streaming this weekend is Apple TV Plus's Blitz from director Steve McQueen. It has had a limited theatrical run for the past couple weeks, but it will now be available to watch at home. Also hitting streaming after a limited theatrical run is The Piano Lesson on Netflix, which is another Oscar hopeful that people will now be able to watch at home. And finally, on Saturday, the final 3 episodes of Arcane Season 2 hit Netflix. This will be the finale of Arcane League of Legends, although it sounds like they're trying to spin off into a bunch of different shows. I actually meant to bring you the Arcane Act 2 review earlier this week, or I should say at the end of the weekend, but life and plans, etc. get in the way. So I will review these last 2 drops of episodes as well as the whole 3rd season once those drop on Saturday. And that's all I've got for you on this week's Charts with Dan. As I mentioned, stay tuned right here for my review of Wicked later today, my review of Gladiator tomorrow, and then maybe, who knows, Spellbound or some of the other stuff later on in the week, plus movie news and reviews and everything else we do here on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out the description below to find out how to become a member of the channel and also to check out our sponsor for this show. And as always, thank you for watching this episode. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.